All right. So we start officially then. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this LASTID and YSI webinar series on science, technology, innovation, and development policy experience in Latin America and the Caribbean. This event is a collaboration between LASTID, the Latin American Caribbean STI and Development Discussion Group, mentored by Professor Carlota Perez, and the Young Scholars Initiative, which Fernando will talk about in a minute. My name is Arthur Moreira. I'm a PhD student at SPRU, the University of Sussex, and today we have the pleasure of having a former State Minister of Colombia, Professor José Antonio Ocampo, to discuss between academia and public service. That's the title of today's talk, interview/conversation. So the conversation between José and Carlota will take around 50 minutes and will be followed by half an hour of a Q&A session between them, the audience, so feel free to interact. And before I introduce them formally, a few words about our group and YSI. Oops, and I did a mistake. Here it is. So, if you want to interact with us, you can send an email to lastipgroup@gmail.com, and then we will include in our mailing list. You can also try to find us on LinkedIn. We have a group. I'll post it on the chat afterwards, the link for the group. And you can also check our previous material on the LALIX web page. It's not up to date right now because of technical issues, but we'll soon all the material will be there, so you can check it. And we also have a YouTube channel with the previous webinars there as well, so you can watch it. So LASTID is a space where people are invited to give a talk about their concrete experience in the design and implementation of STI and development policy. So by analyzing and contrasting those experiences, what has worked, what has not worked, we aim at deriving lessons for future interventions in the region. So our motivation comes from the perception that the interactions between the policy and the academic spheres are not as strong as one would hope, particularly in the global south, where some of the best scientific production is done abroad or in English, which itself may be a barrier. So more knowledgeable civil servants and policymakers with great skills and competence are necessary for the state to lead the way out of the societal challenge that we face and towards a better socioeconomic outcome. If you want, and please do send us emails if you want to receive the news about our next talks. And Fernanda, if you wish to talk a little bit by the YSI.
Thank you, Arthur. So, hello. Coordinator of the economics. Sorry?
Your sound is bad.
But it's back now, I think.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Now, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I am coordinator of the Economics of Innovation Working Group of YSI, Young Scholars Initiative. So just to say a few words about YSI, about our working group. So the Economics of Innovation Working Group became a part of this webinar series early this year. And since then, we have kind of facilitating some inspiring discussion with policymakers and with Professor Carlota Perez. So at this moment, our working group is buzzing with some exciting events, including webinars, workshops, and conferences on the topics of economic innovation. So I'd like to invite you to all to become part of our working group and engage in our projects. And also, if you want to organize a project yourself, you can also contact me and I can help you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernanda. I just posted on the chat our email and the LinkedIn group. And if you have any other questions, you can also send it to us regarding the YSI.
Yeah.
And just some suggestions before we kick in. I'll be keeping a list of the other people who want to ask questions, or if they want to ask themselves. I actually prefer that, but I'll keep, please write down your name so I can keep a list. And you can interact with other participants, write comments, suggest any other materials, feel free. So let them introduce the speaker of today. José Ocampo is a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs and member of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. He has been the UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, as Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and in his country, Colombia, Minister of Finance on 2 occasions, Minister of Agriculture, Director of the National Planning, and member of the Board of Directors of the Central Bank. He's also a member and has been chair of the Committee for Development Policy of United Nations Economic and Social Council and of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. Moreover, he has published extensively on macroeconomic theory and policy, international financial issues, economic and social development, international trade, and Colombian and Latin American economic history. So thank you for being with us, José. And discussing with him is Carlota Perez, honorary professor at IIPP and SPRU, and adjunct professor at the Ragnar Nurks department at Taltech, Estonia. She's the author of Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, and she's been chairing this meeting since the beginning. So thanks a lot for that, Carlota, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arthur. Well, we have a fantastic guest today. We just heard his CV, quite amazing. So I would like to begin more or less looking precisely at that, the fact that you began with a BA in sociology and economics, then you did a PhD in economics, you went on to teaching, heading technical commissions in government, being Minister of Agriculture, Planning and Finance with different governments, occupying important posts in international organizations, and you did all that while working in major universities as a researcher and professor, and writing and editing 70 books and more than 450 articles. So you surely have many important lessons to share with our audience. And that's the whole idea. This sort of series of webinars, seminars live when we began 5 years ago, is meant precisely to make the connection between people who are in academia and people who, being academics, are actually have been or are at present in public service, either as politicians, because if you become a minister, you're actually a politician, or as a technical person in whatever role. So, Jose Antonio, apart from thanking you, because I'm sure you have a lot to tell us, I would like to begin with an important feature of your background, the fact that you have spanned several disciplines in your studies and in your work. You studied both sociology and economics, and you give importance to history in your research and writing. Do you think being an interdisciplinarian has been useful in your different roles? Would you recommend interdisciplinarity to today's young people?
Well, thank you, Carlota, for the invitation to be with all of you. The same to Joao and to Arthur, who, I mean, Joao made the initial contacts, and Arthur is, of course, the organizer of these webinars. Anyway, let me start by saying that in a sense, I do consider myself a broader social scientist, and I think that is actually a very good, very good to interpret some economic processes, which is of course my major activity, but very important for public service. Because there are many things involved. Let me say that, of course, I studied sociology, although I have not practiced sociology too much. But at the same time, I have done extensive readings in political science. In fact, I co-directed a project from UNDP and the Organization for American States on the states of democracies in Latin America 10 years ago, and particularly, this is probably the most important, I am also a historian. And I think that is one of my prides. And I think this issue of, interacting, history, of course, I write generally economic history, but it's very difficult to write economic history without understanding political processes, social transformations. So the broader social scientist perspective is essential to understand history, including economic history. So that is let me say this other social science that I practice quite a bit. In fact, I as you mentioned, it's in my CV. I've done several publications on Colombian economic history, but also Latin American economic history, including, by the way, since you are from Venezuela, at one point, ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America, asked me to write. They wanted to do a kind of economic history of Latin America, but based on the old colonial units. So I did one paper, which was actually on Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, trying to understand the difference, which was very good. Actually, my major conclusion was actually that one of the major differences between the three countries is the political traditions that the three countries have had. In the case of Venezuela, for example, your tendency to have, let's say, dictators for long periods of time. In the case of Ecuador, a lot of political instability, which has been fortunately solved in recent decades. But in the case of Colombia, finally, we have had a political institution that have been relatively stable through history. So we actually the Latin American country which has had the largest number of elected presidents through history, which is Chile used to compete with us, but we are ahead of Chile now. Because Chile had the Pinochet period, which was a long one. Anyway, so that combination, I think, is very good to understand economics, actually, but particularly understand countries, and very essential to when you go into public policy.
Mm-hmm. I understand you started going into government as your first roles were a technical job when you were very young. You later headed some technical committees. How was your experience in those jobs? I understand you began quite young, no, being in government?
Well, let me put it, I graduated very young. So I started my professional life very young, because I got my PhD when I was 23 years old. Wow. So I, getting into government, yes, I was relatively young. And as you're right, I started with two technical jobs. But the first one was an advisor on coffee affairs for the government. Since coffee was at the time, by far the main economic activity of Colombia, it was a link between, of course, a major export and producing sector and a macroeconomic policy. So it was very, very interesting. That period actually was challenging because it was the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement. that had been, more or less, regulating quotas of countries for almost 3 decades. Anyway, so that was a very interesting job. Again, my background, both as in that particular case as a macroeconomist, let's say, but also as a student of coffee history was important because I have written on the coffee history also of Colombia. The second job was actually as immediately after that as an advisor on trade. It was early 90s, a very challenging period because it was when economies were opening up. So the old trade policies were being dismantled, the same. And there was a lot of discussion, not only, I mean, in the case of Colombia, of course, about tariffs, import tariffs, but also about the quantitative restrictions we had for many critical periods, traditional quotas for certain imports or even prohibited imports. So dismantling that and that. But on the other hand, also what we could do with our export policies, because Colombia had adopted a policy of diversification of exports in the mid-1950s, when the coffee prices collapsed at the time. At that time, coffee was like 70% of Colombian exports. So it was an important policy to diversify exports, which was very successful and included several instruments in terms of subsidies and as well as special credit facilities. And what we could do with those instruments in order to maintain the export diversification policy. It was a very interesting period. Let me say that. However, that the point of view that I defended was defeated at the time. I basically argue for a gradual transition, a gradual dismantling of the existing policies. But because of macroeconomic conditions, the government at the time, which was the Gaviria administration, decided to speed up all the tariff reductions and the rest of the new policy. Anyway, it's a very important. By the way, attached to that is of course the issue of production sector policies, which of course you are quite familiar with, and the relation with technology policies, and let me say in that regard that with many constraints, let's say. And product deficiencies in Colombia, as in many other Latin American countries, we had basically a policy to encourage manufacturing production, and which had been more or less successful. Let me say, because Colombia industrialized, but actually one of the big major challenges for Latin America and Colombia included. Is that this transition to the new trade regimes have actually had adverse effects on industrialization. I mean, the term premature deindustrialization, which has been used, proposed by Danny Roderick and others, became a feature of Colombia, and there are some ideas about how to revive production sector policies. But so far, they have not been very effective.
I guess one of the things they promised us was globalization, that there was going to be a lot of investment and trade, but it all went to Asia. It didn't come to us. So somehow
that's it.
So that to welcome everybody, and then we ended up receiving no one.
Yeah, but the difference is that the Asians adopted different trade policies.
Absolutely.
And particularly very different industrial policies and very different technology policies. I mean, Latin America basically thought that by liberalizing trade, and entering into the global economy that way, we were going to be successful. It was going to be a successful growth experience. I think that has shown it not to be correct.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving to your role as minister, you were minister for different parties, and you were also minister of agricultural planning, of finance. I mean, you've sort of covered the whole range. So you must have had to face very serious political complexities, take difficult decisions. You had to reach compromises. How and to what extent did your academic background help you in such positions, or was it mainly just being a political person?
Well, I mean, on your comment about different parties, let me say that in my early political life, from the, let's say, late 1980s to, through the 1990s, I was with one party, which was the Liberal Party of Colombia. At that time, of course, Colombia essentially had two parties, a two-party system that we have inherited from the 19th century. But in more recent times, and particularly in the current government, I of course, I mean, the fragmentation of political parties is immense. So I actually entered, from one movement that was not a party as such. Anyway, it's in this coalition that President Petro developed at the beginning of his administration. Anyway, now, let me say that, of course, the job of a minister is a political job. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, how much are you involved with political processes as such is a question. I was not in any of the periods I was in government. In a sense, in that regard, I had some freedom because I had not come from the political parties themselves. Basically, I was asked to be a minister as a result of my, administrative capacity. For example, by the way, it's very peculiar by international standards that Colombia is one of the countries in which several agriculture ministers were later finance ministers. It's very, very funny, very funny. I was one of those. And that was because of my knowledge of coffee. So coffee was part of the story. Actually, in a sense, at least two of those ministers of agriculture that became minister of finance were associated with coffee, like me. Anyway, I was one of those. Anyway, I actually think that of course the job of a minister is political. But how to manage the technical elements of your portfolio is absolutely essential, which means also, and this is a point that I must underscore, is that the technical team that you have is essential in any political, in any political job. So connecting with a good technical team, I think is one of the strengths. Let's say I think it's a strength of Colombia, at least in the ministries when I work with them. But it's very important. And of course, the political debates, for example, when you have to go through Congress, and then have the political discussion in Congress. Of course, that's something that I had to learn from zero, more or less, in my early political life, let's say. But it's very important, and then how to negotiate becomes a very, very important process. But by the way, that is not independent of your academic background. For example, as an academic, as an economist, let's say, everyone more or less knows what is my school of thought. But there are many schools of thought in economics. And the capacity to have a dialogue between people with different schools of thought is something that I think I have done very well. I think people tend to recognize that I'm very open to discussion with other schools of thought from my point of view, of course. And I think that that it was, I think that was probably very useful for government, because then you have to negotiate, you have to listen to different views, you know, and it's quite good. In Colombia, also very important is the regional perspectives, because Colombia is regionally a very diverse country, and it's understanding as the director of national planning, for example, which is almost a ministerial job in Colombia, although you can say it's part of the presidency. I had, you know, the Department of Planning is in charge of the national plan, which Colombia has had since the 1950s and continues to have. I think it's probably one of the very few countries which actually legally has to have a development plan. Okay, it's actually interesting. But as director of planning, I had to develop the first plan under the 1991 Constitution, which implied that you had to, first of all, it had to be approved by Congress, okay? But also, very important, you have to do consultations with the regions. So these regional consultations was also something like very, very important. Of course, it with, you know, political implications because of the different political inclinations, for example, of Congress people from different regions, but also because then you identify different interests in terms of what they wanted to do with well, the orientation of the national plan. Okay. So this capacity to summarize, have a good technical team, negotiate with Congress based also on which your experience as in public debates, in my case from academia, and the consultations with regions were very, very important process.
And if we look at it the other way, so your academic knowledge and your experience were very useful as a minister. How about your experience in government in terms of its influence and whatever it has given you in your academic career? Would teachers with experience in government be better teachers in some of these areas that we work in?
That's a very good question. Actually, let me say that, you know, when you go in public policy and you go back to academia, you know, the orientation of your academic career or academic research changes somewhat. You know, when you are, you know, let's say in my early life, for example, I did more mathematical models and econometrics than I do now. So, but in turn, your capacity to discuss policies and how to do policies is something for which experience in public policy is very important. So again, in these both, in a case like Colombia, mixing the political debates, let's say, but also the regional interests, which are, you know, two things that are very, very important. Anyway, so I you know, my academic career, actually, by the way, also something very important to probably talk about, which is my experience in international organizations, and even as a minister, you know, the contacts with international organizations. Let's say in the case of agriculture with FAO, in the case of planning, no, nothing really. But in finance, of course, you have to have a lot of contacts with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the IMF, and so forth. And participate in the formal meetings of those organizations. So the you know, those are actually quite important. So the mix of national experience with international experience did change my academic work. For example, I mean, just to say, you know, one particular case, I did a whole book on the international monetary system, okay, which was published a few years ago. That book, for example, I mean, certainly has no econometrics, but has a lot of political analysis, including the history of the system. So it has a first chapter which is historical, but then it has the different debates associated to the international monetary system, in which, let's say, my experience in public policy at the national and the international level were quite important. So yes, this is also true of your activities as a professor. For example, one of the courses that I teach is called Global Economic Governance. It's actually quite a popular course, which I teach at Columbia University, but also here during the summers in Colombia in the Universidad de los Andes. And it's interesting because what I do there is go through the different areas of international cooperation. Development financing, the international monetary system, environment, tax cooperation, etc., in which actually the experience in national government or international institutions is quite important. And let me say, I always find both in New York and Bogota, let's say, that the students value quite highly my knowledge of the concrete way the processes take place.
So it could even be good for an academic to spend some time in government for their own good as teachers. But would you recommend any of those things? I mean, one of the purposes of this series of interviews is to see how attractive public service, international organizations, and all these things could be for a young person's career. People who are now studying innovation policy or all these things that have to do with policy, but they study it as an academic thing, and very often they go back and then maybe just publish in English language journals, because it's very difficult to go up in an academic career if you don't publish in the big journals, which are all in English. So the whole idea of working for government or working for international organizations, would you say that it's do you see people who have better careers if they come in, some of your staff in international organizations or in government? Do you think that's something that you would recommend?
Well, let me say, my students, let's say, to put it that way, go in different directions. I mean, some go into academia and become academics, and some go into national policy. So, for example, in Colombia, the National Planning Department is a good opportunity for young people. And in the mix in that particular organization of good academic knowledge with policy is quite important. And someone is going to international organizations. I mean, they may want to work with the Inter-American Development Bank or UNDP. So there is the different orientation. I value all of them. I value all of them, and of course, many of the people who go in the two other directions may never really get back to academia, so they continue. But then that is a good professional life. I know of many people who have done, their career in government, technical or a mix of technical and political jobs, and the job in international organizations is equally good for many people who value quite a bit. I mean, some cases, but actually, interestingly, for example, the CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, is quite interesting because it's a research center in a very significant sense. Right. So it's that's a place, for example, in which this mix of academia and policy is quite important. And of course, you learn quite a bit by by looking at different national experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean. Anyway, so I think all of them are quite good, and the mix of academia or academic background and policy is quite useful in all of them. By the way, you mentioned in the case of academia one issue which I think is quite important. When it's of course, when you are an academic in the U.S. And you have to become, let's say, get tenure. The issue of publication in major journals is essential, and if you don't do that, you're out. Okay, so I understand the focus on that. But when you are an academic in our countries, I think the obsession with the major international journals, which should be there. I think it's good to have academics from our countries publishing in international journals, but they should also be involved in national journals, and it's very important. So to contribute to the national debate. Okay. Now, for that purpose, having good publications at the national level, good journals, to say, is quite important. And I think, well, Colombia may be one of the countries that has, in economics, for example, has maybe 4 journals that are important for domestic academic debates. And by the way, one of I created one of them in my former academic life when I was in the Universidad de los Andes. It's called Desarrollo Social. By the way, ECLAC or CEPAL has also I think probably the best journal on Latin American issues. The CEPAL Review, or Revista de la CEPAL, actually very interesting that it publishes in both languages, and sometimes in Portuguese and sometimes in Mandarin, actually. So it's actually on economic issues, economic, social, and political issues. Is one of the best, if not the best, journal on Latin American issues.
But of course, the whole problem is that on the one hand, there is the international publications, on the other, the national publications, and then there is the need to engage with actual problems in the country, which very often, even though people are policy specialists, they write, but they don't act in policy, which I find is not their fault. It's because the academic ladder puts as conditions. Number one is the quality of publications and research. They don't value the quality of teaching, especially they value very little participation in helping companies or governments or whatever. So there is something in the university system that goes against what's good for the country, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that many of those experiences should be valued more positively in the academic careers in our countries.
Yeah. So coming to a close, what are the most important intellectuals, in your view, intellectual and relational skills that you have had to cultivate along your professional trajectory? What are the most important assets of a successful academic and or public service career? So if you could say a couple of things that you think have been most important.
Discipline is the most important.
Sorry?
Discipline. Your capacity to go into a subject and do it in depth. Doing the readings and probably some research on those topics. I think it's important. That's what by the way, I always ask my students when they ask me for advice. Be disciplined. I think that's something that I have had since very young, actually since I was a student, because that's a practice that you learn as a student, and I think it's quite important. And probably one of the main responsibilities of professors is to promote that students. But when you go even in political political life, the capacity to know the subject, to have read about the subject and listen to the people who have done research about that subject is quite important. So the discipline in terms of getting into depth in a particular issue is probably by far the most important of all the things you can do. But actually, also again, going back to my question of dialogue, the capacity to have capacity to talk with others, to listen, to understand their views if they are different from yours, and what can you learn from those views, and how you can mix them with your views. That's essential in political life, and I think it's also essential in academic life. I think an economist from a specific school of thought that does not have a dialogue with other professors with the different schools of thought is not a good practice. It's a good practice actually to try to understand what are the alternative points of view to yours, and I think that's a very important. That's a strength, a very important strength. So those two things, if you want me to score two, those are the two: discipline and dialogue.
Discipline and dialogue. I was going to end, as I always do, asking you what the most important lesson you would like to share with the students, but I think you just did. Is that the one, or do you have another lesson?
No, those are my two two recommendations. And I think building that is something that you have to do through life. It's not actually again, you start as a student, particularly in discipline, in trying to understand a subject, do research on a subject, and even I must say that one of the most interesting things in my student life was to write papers, because papers, aside from exams, but the papers, and I actually value very strongly the paper that my students write. I think because papers are the mechanism by which you have to get deeply into a subject, a specific subject. And I think the discipline of doing that is very important. And by the way, it's interesting that I started actually in my high school. Some of my professors actually requested us to do papers. And I think even some, on some subject that you don't think of. Since I was for example, in a Catholic high school, one of the most interesting papers I did was on this guy Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin, a very philosopher, Catholic philosopher. And I got deeply, I read his books. I researched about what his controversy. He was a very interesting fellow. Anyway, that's of course a Jesuit. Like I was in a Jesuit high school, so it was very interesting. But the discipline of writing that paper for me, for example, was a very important topic. But then in the university, on the undergraduate, as a graduate student, the papers were for me some of the most important things. So exams are important, but papers, I would say, are even more important because of this issue of discipline, of trying to get in deeply into subjects. That's what you do more with papers.
Good. Thank you very much. We're going to now open the floor to the participants to ask questions. So maybe, is it you, Arthur, that's going to take over?
Yes, exactly. So if anyone has a question, can raise a hand or unmute and go ahead. Yeah, João, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question goes in the direction of bringing your experience and the days that we're going through. And the specific question is, given that the high level of uncertainty that we live on all different fronts, besides the discipline, what are the type of disciplines of knowledge base that young people should have in order to face uncertainty? The quantitative, the hardcore economics, multidisciplinarity, history. How we prepare for uncertainty?
Well, it's a very good question, but I understand that preparing for uncertainty is preparing for I'm not totally sure it's different from preparing for normal life. But I mean, you have to have a good knowledge of topics. And in economics, certainly it's theory, but it's also quantitative skills. But quantitative skills are quite important particularly for young, students. So I mean, the prospects in life of having good quantitative background. I mean, for me, that was very important. But of course, now it's much more sophisticated, and the capacity to do, quantitative analysis is quite good, including things that I never did. For example, surveys. How to do a good survey, which is very important to understand discrepancies in social systems. Anyway, but I think the mix of good theoretical knowledge continues to be important. But again, the issue of dialogue is quite important, because in this era of uncertainty, what are the different expectations, which is or the contrasting expectations, which is part of what generates uncertainty, is quite important. So the capacity to have dialogues of different character with different social actors, even symposia in which you can contrast different views of people, I think is quite important. Of course, but at the end, uncertainty has to be managed with policies that try to generate a direction for where you go, and that's again a particular case in which the capacity to have a dialogue and then to choose in what direction to go, I think is probably the most important. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So Fernanda, go ahead, please.
Experience with us. So my question is that there appears to be a growing trend in Brazil where students are increasingly opting for private universities over public ones, despite the high quality and international acclaim of Brazilian public universities. And private universities often offer more technical programs that lead to easier graduation, let's say. So I'm not sure if this is there is a similar trend that we can observe in other Latin America countries. So my question is, if I would like to hear your perspective on the state of economics education in Latin America or even in the US, and if you could provide any insights on the situation in Colombia.
That's let me say, I value positively the competition between public and private universities. I think it's a good system, actually. With different inclinations. I of course don't like when they go to extremes. For example, I mean, some private universities in Colombia go to, or in the US, go to very I don't know what to call them, ultra-orthodox views. But then some of the public universities sometimes go into the opposite, into extreme leftist views. And I don't like that. But within the, a more, perhaps a narrower spectrum is actually quite good. Colombia actually has a good mix of that. And the U.S. also has a very good mix. I mean, some of the very good universities of the U.S., let's say, for example, Berkeley, University of California, is excellent, and it's one of the great competitors in economic analysis with some of the private universities. So, but anyway, so I actually value very positively on. They actually promote also diversity of views, because but we should actually be based on not on the let's say on the biases, let's say, of the university presidents or directors or board of trustees, but actually on having a good team of professors, which of course may interact, and people tend to choose certain groups because they are more alike, more similar to their views. So the differences in even among public universities or even among private universities in economics do reflect that, and actually is quite good, because then you have a development of different schools of thought, which again in my perspective is a positive thing to have diversity of views and analysis, which actually make things richer in terms of analysis. Anyway, I don't know if I have exactly answered your question, but that's my view. I'm not sure. It's a good question about the Brazilian system. I don't know it well enough to make a comment on that, but anyway, it's interesting that in some cases the universities are public, but they defend very right-wing views in economics. For example, the Catholic University of Chile, which is actually a public university more, and even historically was a private university, but it's compared to the University of Chile, for example. I mean, the contrast between the two, I know very well because I lived 6 years in Chile. And so contrasting inviting different professors from either of the two universities was actually quite good. Those are, different schools of thought reflected in universities.
Amal, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm Amal. I'm from SPRU at the University of Sussex, and I'm one of my country's delegates to COP on climate finance. I'm doing that as a voluntary task, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is sometimes I find the slow pace of the negotiations or the whole multilateralism system around climate finance negotiations tend to be a bit confusing because it's not moving that fast. And especially if I compare it to the fast-paced mode delivery of the private sector. So my question is, how do you often, or what do you advise, I mean, early career or early starters, people who are getting exposed to the multilateral system and the whole package to maintain or to be consistent? I know you mentioned discipline, but sometimes it can get a bit emotional, or like those makes a feeling of unfairness and wanting to do more, but often hit by the reality of this is the system that we've got. So yeah, I hope I made myself clear.
Yeah, well, actually, that's an evolving field, climate finance, both in terms of analysis and in terms of policy. So it's quite I mean, it's why let's say it's one of the fields in which knowledge is increasing, and we have limited knowledge of what works and what doesn't work well. So it's also a field in which the national and international is crucial, because there are international commitments, but then you have national policies, and national policies may use certain international, issues or not, or international views, let's say. So it's actually quite interesting. But let me say that, I mean, actually, when you see the debates this year in different forums, be the United Nations, but being the G20, or the reforms of the World Bank, for example. In all of them, this issue is quite central, and there, for example, very different perspectives for what they used to be in some cases. I mean, let me put it this way: there is a very strong view that there should be more climate financing for middle-income countries with an element of low cost or a concessional finance of different sort. So the concessional finance in climate should not only be for low income but also to middle-income countries. That's, for example, one of the consensuses that I see in the literature this year in the global debate on the topic. And the second is that there has to be a very different ways of combining public and private financing, because in many cases it is the private firms that have to do the job, and how you support them, and again, in some cases you have to give concessional finance to those private firms. So how do you manage those issues? I think it's an evolving topic, which is quite interesting. But that's an evolving issue. So we are learning what works and what doesn't work, and we'll continue to learn because we still don't know, what is best in this area. But it's a very important and significant topic now.
Franco.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlota, and thank you, Jose, for the great conversation. It's so inspiring for young researchers. Well, I am a PhD student at Lund University in Sweden, and also I am a researcher at the Universidad Mayor de San Simón in Bolivia. My research topic is looking for a model to develop innovation about the business models and with business model innovations for SMEs in Bolivia. But I have a question, perhaps it's a big question. What will be the best activity or advice from your experience for research to be appreciated in difficult environments, such countries as a lower or middle income countries' economies, to develop and appreciate the research and to apply in real context than us, for example, in Bolivia? What will be your best advice?
Yeah, I guess that's a complex question because, particularly because of the Bolivian situation, and it's probably true of other countries in Latin America. I mean, the domestic conditions are difficult. But let me say that one thing that when you do academic research but want to apply to policy, is to be able to speak with let's put it, with different levels of maybe this is wrong to say, but simplicity in the analysis. So let's say in academic life, you can have more sophisticated discussions about this and that, and then they do, econometric analysis of what works and what doesn't work anyway. That's totally useless for the public debate. For the public debate, you have to be able to explain things in the simpler, I would say the simplest possible way, in order to enter into the debate. And of course, you have diversity, like you have in Bolivia, let's say, or in many Latin American countries. You have to be able to those proposals to be able to be readable for different political inclinations, let's call it. Okay, so it's not so you don't have to write for a political party. That's not the job. It's actually to write some proposal that can be accepted by different political schools, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, we have had a question from Laura.
Hi. First of all, thanks for your webinar, very insightful. I have a couple of questions. First, Do you think that nationality influence in a way the school of thought of a researcher? And second is about the competition between academics. You spoke about publish in more, local magazines. However, I perceive that the competition is very rough. So at the end, you look to publish in this most prestigious magazine. So at the end, how do you see a way to democratize or to raise the level of the of publications in not prestigious magazines, in a way to say it? It's the most famous one, perhaps.
Yeah, let me say on the first, I mean, in principle, nationality should not matter for academic life, but they do. It depends heavily on the traditions of in different countries. Let me, for example, take one particular case. They say the French, for example, do have very different schools of thought on social and economic and historical issues from the, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon tradition. I found myself, I mean, sometimes I don't agree with the French, but reading the French was actually is always good, even for for people who have have been trained, let's say, more in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is my case, for example. Okay, now the Anglo-Saxon tradition, of course, has different schools of thought. I was brought up in my my student days, and I was doing my PhD between what at the time was called the Cambridge controversy, which showed between Cambridge, U.S., that is Harvard, MIT, versus Cambridge, England, University of Cambridge, and they have different schools of thought, and very useful. Not to say the other controversy, which is more a U.S. controversy with the University of Chicago. Which was the right wing, let's say, in the economic debates anyway. So, again, that's true. But again, so different nationalities and even local traditions do matter. In the case of Latin America, for example, the Brazil has developed its own schools of thought, and I have always found them to be very interesting. And they have, brought up to the Latin American debate some interesting contributions. Difficult to see there was schools of thought in other countries, which are, I think Brazil probably stands out as one country that has had different schools of thought. Anyway, so nationalities sometimes do matter because of different traditions of thought that have taken place. And when I talk about dialogue, and understanding different schools, I also mean you have to be able to search in all those schools of thought of different countries what you think is interesting.
Thank you.
Okay.
For your answer.
So we have Pavel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much, Jose, for sharing your experience as academic and policymaker, let's say. And my question is related to the role you had as a policymaker, as a former ministry. A couple of years ago, Colombia created a new ministry to promote innovation, science, technology. The Ministry of Knowledge, Technology, and Innovation, I think, is the name. What is your view, your political and policy view related to this path Colombia went to promote this kind of activities, and given your experience as a former ministry in your country? Thank you very much.
That's a very good question. I didn't like the creation of the ministry. I was opposed to that. For one reason, which is the fact that or maybe two reasons. Science and technology is an issue that has to cross across the whole of government. So having a ministry gives an inclination that sometimes is not necessarily very good. And second, which has been very clear in Colombia, because they put political appointees, which are not necessarily the best to lead science and technology. So we used to have conciencias. I mean, we had the tradition of conciencias. And my view, conciencias was always led by a good academic, not by anyone with political inclinations, let's say, and actually was quite good at managing the heterogeneity of interest of different parts of society, let's say, in terms of science and technology. Anyway, so is now on the other hand, there are other problems. When you have an institute like conciencias. I mean, historically, it was associated to the Ministry of Education. Question mark whether the Ministry of Education is the best place to have science and technology, let's say. So after that, at one point, it was transferred to the Department of Planning. When I was planning, head of planning department, Conciencia depended on planning. And I think it was actually probably the best arrangement because the national planning department by itself is also a cross-cutting institution that deals with different parts of government. Anyway, then they thought transferring to be an institute of the presidency was better. I think it was a stupid idea because there was no way for the president to take a hard look at science and technology directly. So I think it was a bad idea. And then came the idea of making the ministry. Anyway, it's not an easy job. But again, I don't like the idea of it being the ministry for the two reasons I mentioned. And I actually think some cross-cutting perspectives are much better in the case of the science and technology. Of course, our other problem, which is the problem of most Latin American countries, or all Latin American countries, is that we invest very little money into science and technology. I think that's probably the most important issue. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll take the opportunity and ask a question as well before I give the word to Jonathan. And Jose, you talked a bit about your experience with the coffee sector in Colombia, and I'm from Minas Gerais, so is João Carlos, and we are currently producing half of the coffee in Brazil, our state. So having you and having Carlota here, I would like to take the opportunity to ask you both maybe about your views on the role of natural resources for economic growth, your views on economic strategies. As it makes me really angry, the participation of Minas, of Brazil, of Colombia in the value chain. It's rather obscene. I don't know if people watch this HBO show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. Last episode was about cocoa, and it's more or less the same story, that a few countries in the global south produce most of the beans, and then a few companies in the global north control the processed product, and farmers just get about 1% of the value. So they earn below the poverty line, and they have to go and grow those crops and deforest some land. They have to employ child labor. So if there was a more balanced value chain for those sectors, and Professor Kunle, he just wrote a piece on Project Syndicate claiming for producing countries to take matters into our own hands. That means to create cartel, OPEC-like, to buy companies in the north, brands, so we can skip a bit the tariffs, because they charge 0 for unprocessed beans, and they charge up to 20% on roasted coffee beans. So what are your views? What was your experience dealing with that sector as well? And what are your suggestions? Shall we cartel it up? Colombia and Brazil start it?
No, it's a good question. Actually, let me say that Colombia is better in terms of coffee policy than Brazil. In Brazil, actually, it was better in the past. I think there has been a deterioration. I mean, let's say when you do a natural resource sector, first of all, you have to have the science and technology of that sector well done. By far, the research center on coffee in Colombia, the Science and Technology Center in Coffee, is probably the best of the world. It's advised to me. Of course, it's on soft coffees. So we are not good on robustas. The knowledge of the robusta, I leave that to Nestlé, which are the most important research center in that regard. But second, you have to go to do the whole value chain, and I think it's important to control the trading or your good, and actually to go into manufacturing of the good. For example, the National Federation of Coffee Growers also developed one of the best freeze-dried coffees factories of the world. So that's also so you have to go to really do an integrated development of the sector, including science and technology, or research, science and technology, and the value chain. Now, internationally is more complicated, and it's a good question mark whether you can be successful internationally perhaps some there could be not in this sector, in many other natural resource sectors, firms that are created by countries which are producing countries in order to control more the sector. Anyway, not a very it's not a very successful area. I mean, Colombia does have two features which are interesting, which is the development of Juan Valdez. Which perhaps the only problem of Juan Valdez is that was developed too late. It should have been developed earlier, and perhaps we could have a much better international chain. But it is actually relatively successful, not in the whole world, but in some, certainly in Latin America and in some, and that's one. I've heard that the Colombia has put a lot of emphasis into the high quality coffees, and in terms of export policy for coffee, and they're basically national firms, including the Federation of Coffee Growers, that export, and we capture part of the benefits from high quality coffee. Not probably enough, but the Colombian coffee earns a premium in many cases in the order of 30% or even more relative to other soft coffees. So it's a very integrated policy that does work. Somehow in Brazil, which had, of course, the best institutions in coffee, let's say when I started to work on this, there has been not the same level of development that we have had. And in all of those areas, I think Colombia is better than Brazil now. It's probably one of the best in the world as a coffee producing country. But now that case could be applied to many other sectors when you think of it. Let's say, for example, on a mineral of transition, lithium. Where the lithium producers, Chile being probably the most advanced in that regard, can get into try to develop anyway the technology, but also the processing, and be exported not of not of the mineral, but also the products that are made with lithium. Is actually a good policy. By the way, when I was finance minister recently, I was surprised to know, because I didn't know, of the opportunities for Colombia in copper, which is another transition mineral, let's say. And but, so the international firms that are active in copper, several came to talk with me, and what I value more, first of all, is knowledge of what the hell we had in copper reserves, which we are not exploiting. It's I didn't even know that the Andes are the richest in the world in terms of copper reserves. That was for me a big surprise to know. But anyway, but aside from that, is whether you export the mineral or you develop domestically the products using copper, which is again a very important choice. And some of the companies said, we'll develop the copper in Colombia, including the industrial products associated with copper. And I think that's probably so the whole value chain is, and that's a particular case, but there are many, many more. Now, in international trade, it's a more complicated story because, how you get involved in international trade, you with your commodities is difficult, and commodity trade is highly concentrated in the hands of very few firms.
Thanks a lot for your views. So, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the presentation, Professor. I'm Colombian. I just finished my master at Spruce in Sussex also, and my research and my job currently is focused on artificial intelligence. So I was curious about your opinion about this technology, and by leveraging your experience in international economics and international political issues, like, what is your opinion about it, and like especially in LATAM, like what Latin American countries should be doing in that regard?
Oh, we should get into it fully. I mean, that's the current. I mean, as part of this fourth, science and technology revolution, let's say. I think artificial intelligence is of course critical. I mean, the artificial intelligence, of course. By the way, I was totally alien to the topic, but I actually had a meeting a week ago, actually, in which I was asked to moderate a panel on artificial intelligence. So I had to start reading and learning about that. And I mean, as all the technological revolutions will have effects on employment, this quality employment in this particular case, and what you do with that effect is crucial. At the same time, of course, like any new technology, it can improve. I have significant improvements for for society. For example, let me take one particular case, which is information. I mean, what you can get in terms of information from this, well, all the digital revolutions has been very positive in that regard. Artificial intelligence is another case. I mean, just let me say an example of a friend who's a medical doctor who told me more or less the following. He said, if you are a very good medical doctor, you may have through your life maybe 1,000, 2,000 good interesting cases that and then you can use your that knowledge in order to. Now you can get with artificial intelligence in an hour 1 million cases, and so the possibility in terms of information is fantastic. Now, the basic problem, and I think that's an international topic that we are only really starting to work on at the international level, even at the national level in some countries, is the issue of regulation. Because artificial intelligence does generate major risks in terms of I mean, all the digital transformation has, of course, generated risk in terms of false informations of different character, even telling to a broad public lies about, for example, what a person, for example, in politics thinks. Now this is worse because you can do that, but using the voice and the image of that person. So how you regulate that and how you avoid those problems, I think is a major international. The artificial intelligence companies are already thinking what the hell they can do about that. But anyway, it's not an easy issue. I mean, when you think of the internet, well, actually, with what happened with other previous cases with the digital economy, they were not very well handled. Anyway, in Twitter, for example, and for example, the decision at one point to stop Trump from using Twitter, but at the same time, the fact that that was not held by the new buyer of Twitter, now X, of course, a very funny name for a company, but anyway, but that is one particular case. How you manage that regulation is very crucial with the digital economy, and we're not very far in advancing how to do that. And that includes international regulation, of course, because if you don't do global regulation, you're going to have lots of problems too. Anyway, that's I reminded the people, because I was involved in that discussion about the discussion of who regulates internet and the position of developing countries that WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, should be in charge of that, which was, of course, vetoed by the U.S., which continued to rule the internet. So all those international issues are quite important too. Anyway, but this is of course a promising area, so continue working on it.
All right, so we are heading towards the end here, and I don't see any hands left. But as always, I'll leave the final words to Professor Carlota if she wants to add something.
Little question left, which is about the issue of consensus. I think that our institutions, which are for many reasons very bureaucratic and very up-down, all decisions taken at the top, are showing themselves to be very incapable of facing the territorial problems, because since the world is now needing so much in terms of natural resources, and because also we are having internet can go anywhere, all the way into the territory, I think we're going to not have this model of big cities and empty farming areas and so on. Do you think that we are going towards, what do you think we need to do in order to build consensus, all these conflicts about mines, the Indians complaining, the others, there is a lot of obstacles because we don't have organizations to organize consensus. Do you think that's something that's important? Have you seen anything moving in that direction?
Very important question, and an area in which the world is very weak now, because in a sense the weakening of multilateralism that has taken place, I think is a major problem for the world. And many, for example, artificial intelligence, to mention that case, what is the topic is not even discussed at regulatory level at the international level. It's a lot of national discussions and taking place, and there are many other issues like you mentioned that are important. Now, how do you build consensus? It's a question, I think, first of all, of strengthening multilateralism again, but of course, it's always a question, like all consensus take time. Dialogue, trying to generate agreements, etc., which are not always, of course, easy to reach. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been extremely interesting. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. And of course, we will have this recorded and up on our LALIX page and on YouTube. So we will be able to listen to it and to tell other people to listen, because it's been very enriching. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. Thank you very much, everybody. And we will have probably another session in December. Joao, I think you know who it's going to be, and you're going to be the interviewer.
Yes, we are talking with Matthias Kulfas. He is a professor at the University of San Martin in Argentina, and he was a Minister of Industry, Ministro de la Producción, Desarrollo Productivo of this current government. So maybe he, and in a country called Argentina, so it may be a very interesting seminar, but we'll let you know. And this is coming soon. Jose Antonio, thank you for being with us. And I have one personal thing. Are you in your, because of a different thing and using this place here, can we talk on your Colombian phone? Can I give you a call soon?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. I have something very short to talk to you, and when this ends, I'll call you then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good.
And sorry,
very good.
people, for using the
Carlota,
opportunity.
Joao, and Arthur for the invitation to be with you today. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone, and hope to see you next month then.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carlota. It was really nice.
I wonder what happened to these three people. Maybe they're gone. Are you still there, Kata? Jasmine?
Maybe they left for coffee. And Kata, actually, she asked a question. I just saw it now on the chat, but I'll try to email him with it.
She asked a question in the chat.
Yeah, she had the question. I just saw it now. But I'll email Ocampo with the question, then I'll try to get back to her. Stop recording here.
Here it is. How to approach regional stakeholders in a country like Colombia, Maricel. Let's see.